Big win for the Cincinnati Bengals there. We'll take a look at their top 5 graded players in this one. Cornerback Mike Hilton at the very top of the list with an 82.8, and then wide receiver T. Higgins next on the list at an 81.4. Defensive tackle B.J. Hill with a 79.8. Wide receiver Jamar Chase 71.1, and then center Ted Karras with a 70.6. Joe Burrow would have been number 2 on that list, right behind Mike Hilton with an 82.3 overall grade. New York Giants edge rusher Brian Burns at the top of their list with an 87.8. Linebacker Bobby Okereke with a 75.0. Andrew Phillips back in the lineup here, 74.5. At number 3, offensive tackle Andrew Thomas. Man, it was a tough matchup with him going up against Trey Hendrickson all night long, but he still earned a 73.8 overall grade. And then defensive tackle Rakeem Nunez-Roches with a 73.4. Daniel Jones in this one, 54.5. Stat that told the story. Dalton, what do we got?
Simple. The New York Giants did not have a single play that went for longer than 15 yards. It's just without Malik Neighbors, there isn't any explosiveness. Daniel Jones on 10-plus yard throws, 2 for 8, 30 yards, and an interception. And he kind of ties into my most disappointing here is it's just the Giants, we're pretty sure they're going to be looking for a new quarterback in the offseason, right? I mean, there's just no explosiveness. There's nothing. And it's not that there's not maybe fast players out there, right? Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt. It's just Daniel Jones working down the field, especially without Malik Neighbors. It just doesn't work. And they're even in the run game, just the lack of big plays. Tyrone Tracy had one explosive run for I think exactly 10 yards. Daniel Jones had a couple others because they got him going in the run game a little bit, but they just can't. It's so hard for them to work down the field, to work extended drives when they're going 4, 3, 6 yards at a time. And even in the passing game, when there's just no threat of them getting over the top without Malik Neighbors. Look, Daniel Jones is 5 for 21 on deep passes this year. 3 of those 5 are to Malik Neighbors. Yeah. That's pretty much just it. And he's not that force multiplier that's gonna throw guys open downfield and do all that. We saw it in the Dallas game. If they could complete any deep balls in that game, and they were open, a couple of them, they would have won that game. But their lack of explosiveness just kills them. And honestly, yeah, the receivers, when you're missing your number 1 receiver, it's hard. But to have just again, every play in this game for the Giants was 15 yards or less. Their defense was darn well good enough to win this game. More than really, the score was 10-7. The last touchdown is what it is. You held the Cincinnati Bengals in the real part of this football game to 10 points. And just because they couldn't make any explosive plays, he's got a 63.4 passing grade on the year on 10-plus throws. It's just not working. They just cannot get the ball downfield at all.
Bengals defensive line was the stat that told the story here for me, because we have talked for weeks about how this is just Trey Hendrickson and no one else. And last night it was not. And honestly, over the last 2 weeks, and the Bengals playing really well. Obviously, they come up short against the Baltimore Ravens in overtime, but they could have won that game, and I think it's because of the rejuvenation of that defensive line. Trey Hendrickson is still playing well, but 65.4 overall grade for the defensive line specifically, so the edge rushers and the interior defensive linemen as a collective. That was the highest single game grade that they've had so far this season. Both the pass rush and the run defense was above 60 for the first time this season, which means the floor of the defensive line is getting a lot higher for the Cincinnati Bengals, which is very, very important. And then Sam Hubbard, B.J. Hill, 2 of their highest graded games of the season came in the past 2 weeks, which is huge because that means it's not just Trey Hendrickson and no one else. So to me, that was the stat that told the story, is for a team that was able to have explosives last week against the Seattle Seahawks, couldn't really get that going, especially on the ground with Tyrone Tracy, and it's because Mike Hilton was flying to the ball and made a lot of good plays, but also the defensive line was holding up on their end of the bargain as well. So an improved Bengals defensive line, to me, signals that this team's not out of it yet. You cannot count the Cincinnati Bengals out. It's very frustrating how behind the 8 ball they are when it comes to record, but this is a team that's going to, I think, play their best ball moving forward, especially on the defensive line. Who's your most impressive and then most disappointing?
Most disappointing, Daniel Jones. Already went on that speech. That's just kind of where it's at for the Giants. Okay. Most impressive, I know it's a low-scoring game. It's Joe Burrow. Look, if they were 4-2 instead of 2-4, we would call him the MVP right now. He's right now. He's the third highest graded quarterback in football.
I had him as my MVP going into the season, so that makes me mad.
Did we both take him? I don't remember.
Did you have him?
Did I take him as I think I did.
I know I had him.
I had him for that 5,000-yard season. I remember that part.
Yes.
But
on your bold call.
It's just I mean, you know what? One of the signature games of his career was the Titans game in the playoffs when he was sacked 8 or 9 times, and that game was kind of low scoring, and he just keeps his cool, and he does what it takes to win, right? That's what the great ones do. We saw Brady do it for so long. We see Mahomes do it almost every week. Joe Burrow has that as well. This was an ugly game. The Giants' defensive line is really good. Brian Burns was on an absolute burner, no pun intended. Dexter Lawrence is always great.
Yep.
And Burrow just keeps it going. Look, got a 47-yard touchdown run because he sees, man coverage and nobody's spying, and I guess they're just going to leave half the field open. He makes big plays. He doesn't get enough credit for how well he improvises all the time. And let's be real, when the Giants didn't get the pass rush going, 16 of 19 in a clean pocket for a $163 and a 91.5 overall grade in a clean pocket. This is what Joe Burrow does. I mean, if there's any doubt that he's an elite quarterback, I'm not sure what part you're doubting. I mean, he's just one of the, 3 or 4 best quarterbacks in the league. And teams like that don't usually get off to these types of starts and they're usually at least in playoff contention, right? So if the Bengals are going to get back in this, obviously Burrow's raging hot right now. This game, not a lot of points, but he was still the best player on the field. The defensive line's a huge key because that was the one problem that I wasn't sure that they were going to fix. Their passing game was going to get fixed. They needed T. Higgins healthy, plain and simple, right? And they needed Chase to get in a rhythm after the contract stuff.
Right.
That was easy. Their offense was going to come. If the D-line can stay at least decent, and this isn't the best O-line they were playing in the Giants, but if they can stay at least decent and be good enough and make enough stops, the Bengals can work their way back into this because they have an MVP caliber quarterback.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I think that Joe Burrow is playing incredibly well, and it's...
You could argue they're 2-4, and they are this close from being 6-0. They've been right there in every single game they've been playing. And other than the New England game, they didn't score because they didn't have Chase or Higgins, I don't think. The other games, the other 3, they should at least be 5-1, just if the defense played any better at all.
Mm-hmm. It's a frustrating team, but I think they're going to play better moving forward. We'll just see if they're too far behind the 8 ball yet to make the playoffs. But if they do make it into the playoffs, I think they're going to be one of the hottest teams that's in there. Most impressive, full transparency, I wrote my notes before you did, so I had Azeez Ojulari because I thought you were going to do Brian Burns. I was leaving Brian Burns for you. But
no,
I want to the chat. Drake in the chat saying hey, you got to talk about Brian Burns.
Don't ever forget I could default to a quarterback.
No, and
I will find a reason to.
No, the Joe Burrow call was a good one, obviously, but I'm just saying I had Azeez Ojulari in there thinking that you were going to take Brian Burns because we had to talk about Brian Burns, but I'll talk about both. It's okay.
Take the whole crew then.
Most impressive Giants defensive line. There we go. No Kayvon Thibodeau in this one, so Azeez Ojulari I think really stepped up. 67.2 overall defensive grade, which was his highest of the season. He had 2 sacks, 6 pressures, and an 11.5 pass rush win percentage. But, we got to talk about Brian Burns as well, who had an 87.8 overall grade in this game. That was the 3rd highest, or I believe that was the 6th highest overall game grade that he has had in his entire career. And then when it comes to the 80.1 run defense grade in particular, Brian Burns has not always been great at defending the run. So that is the 3rd highest single game run defense grade that he has had in his career. So this is somebody who was all over the field. He was doing exactly what he needed to do, especially in run defense. This is a 3-down edge rusher. And this is the player, Chris said, first name basis, Chris Collinsworth, obviously, said last night on the broadcast, these are the games and this is the performance of why you traded and why you signed Brian Burns. He was able to have a massive impact, and that defensive line, I think, tried to do what they could do to make this a football game. But ultimately, when I look at the most disappointing to me, it was just the Giants finishing drives. It felt like this was a defensive battle going back and forth. You mentioned some of the lack of explosives that the Giants had. It felt like the Bengals could have had more explosives themselves outside of the long Joe Burrow run earlier in the game. But really, when you look at it, Giants were 1 for 2 in the red zone. The Bengals were able to capitalize in the red zone, and then the Giants were over 2 in field goals. Bengals were able to capitalize with their field goals. That's kind of just what it came down to, right? You have the missed field goals and the lack of capitalization in the red zone. That's the 10-point difference in a 17-7 game. And so that was, to me, the most disappointing there for the Giants, being able to finish those drives and make it a little bit closer, maybe even get the victory here for you. But